Good morning, and thank you for coming out on Monday morning again, and another good turnout. Thank you. We haven't got Yvonne this morning, so you've got me, I'm afraid. But I've only got two things to say. One is the normal one about telephones. If you could just please make sure you've got the phone on mute, that would be good. The other one. Bob Kerr, standing over there, is trying to gauge the amount of interest there might be in one of the groups being an AI group. Obviously, it's a very popular subject at the moment. So if it's something that you're interested in, would you please make your way to Bob after the talk, and he'll give you some details about a meeting he wants to set up to give you an idea of what the agenda would be for that. Okay, thank you. So this morning, what we've got, Alex has kindly come over from Glenturret Distillery, is going to tell us about the history of the distillery, and also explain to us what the restaurant also does over there. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to Alex. Thank you.
So my name is Alex, Alex Thomson. I am the Visitor Attraction Manager at the Glenturret Distillery. I always like to start when I'm talking about the distillery or whiskey in general, just sort of talking a little bit about myself. Sounds very arrogant, I know. We'll talk about me first, then on to the important part. So I'm from Highland, Perthshire. I grew up just outside Aberfeldy in Grantley. Anybody who's from that neck of the woods might know the Thomson family. West Park Farm is where the family's based. I very, very early on decided farming was not for me. It seemed far too much like hard work, to be honest with you. I liked talking and I liked history. So at the age of 16, I got a job working in Blair Castle as a tour guide. Did that on the weekends while I was still at school. Realised you could make a career out of that. So at 18, I moved to Edinburgh and I studied international tourism management at Napier University. I needed a job to support my studies. So I ended up finding myself working at the Scotch Whisky Experience on the Royal Mile. Now, if you've never been at the Scotch Whisky Experience before, I can highly recommend it. It's owned by the entire Scotch whisky industry, so you don't just hear about one brand, you hear about everybody. The joke within the whisky industry is we refer to it as the Scotch Whisky Training Academy, because if you go to any whisky company anywhere, not just in Scotland, but internationally these days, you will find someone in a reasonably senior position who started their career as an 18-year-old tour guide at the Scotch Whisky Experience. It's an incredible alumni network. It's absolutely fantastic. So I did that throughout my whole degree, and then decided that whiskey was for me, really. So I found myself back home, working at Aberfeldy Distillery, being part of the visitor centre management team there. And then about 3 years ago, made the move over to the dark side, moved down to Crieff, and I work at Glenturret Distillery now. So my passions really are whiskey, our history, and sort of getting those across to people. I think the Scotch whisky industry is such an amazing thing. If you look around the world, there are something like 50 countries these days that produce whiskey. Places that you wouldn't expect, like Australia, Spain, the Czech Republic, they all have sort of burgeoning whiskey industries. Australia actually has more whiskey distilleries than Scotland, which is a little bit weird. But if you look at the global production of whiskey, Scotland, a country of only sort of 5 million people, actually produces over half of all of the world's whiskey. Now that's taking into account the United States and Canada, who are massive producers of whiskey. We actually still make over half the world's whiskey, something that Scottish people should be incredibly proud of. Now, before we get into the actual Glenturret stuff, I want to start by just giving you a little bit of context about whiskey and sort of getting into sort of where Glenturret comes from. So we'll start in the 15th century with this man here. This is King James IV of Scots. Very important man in Scottish history, responsible for probably the darkest day in Scottish history, the Battle of Flodden in 1513. Importantly for us, though, James IV is the first recorded whiskey drinker in Scottish history. In 1494, he ordered some whiskey to be produced at Lindores Abbey, so the ruins of the abbey just there in Newborough, formerly in Perthshire, stolen by Fife. We'll come back for it one day. Fifers and Stirling, they love stealing the best parts of Perthshire. Now, we know this happened because we have it in the Rolls of the Exchequer. So the Rolls of the Exchequer for 1494 has a record for 8 bowls of malt to Friar John Core, wherewith to make aqua vitae. Now, Friar John Core was a monk. He was one of the Black Friars. This is not actually him, but it's what they looked like at the time. Friar John Core was based at Lindores Abbey. There was an offshoot. There was the Tyrrhenesian monks who were based at Lindores Abbey, and they're recorded as the site of the first distillation in Scotland. Now, James IV had a couple of uses for this spirit that he had produced. This is the 3 main uses that he had here. We have a record in about 1503 of Uisce Beha being sent to the powder. Now, aqua vitae is the Latin name for this spirit, the water of life. Uisce Beha is the Gaelic term for it, the water of life. It's interchangeable at this time. Now, the powder references the gunpowder factory located at Edinburgh Castle, because James IV, typical Stuart king, was obsessed with cannons, despite the fact that his own grandfather, James II, was blown up by one of his own cannons while sieging Roxburgh Castle. Didn't put the family off. So we have this record that they would take this high percentage alcohol spirit and they would actually mix it with the gunpowder, because they realized that if you then did that and set the gunpowder alight, it would actually give the gunpowder a bit more of a kick. Now, the next use we have for it is this rather dashing man up in the corner here. This is a guy called John Damian. Now, John Damian was an Italian scientist. He was a contemporary of Leonardo da Vinci, and we think they may have met at some point when they were younger. And he was the king's personal scientist. He was based in a little lab in Stirling Castle, and the king believed that John Damian could unlock the secret to alchemy, where you could turn base metals into gold. Now, they believed that the way to unlock alchemy was by finding the missing 5th element, and the king actually believed that aqua vitae may have been the 5th element. So they believed that if you melted iron ore, poured in a load of whiskey, and then smelted it, it would come out as gold. Now, good news, of course, that did work, which is why we are the richest country in the world today. No, unsuccessful, unfortunately. John Damian is most famous, though, for what he's doing in that picture. See, John Damian, as I said, was the contemporary of Da Vinci. One of the most famous things about Leonardo da Vinci is his flying machines. So John Damian actually built his own flying machine, which was a giant set of wooden and waxwork wings with chicken's feathers attached to them. Now, he tested out this flying machine one day when there was a delegation leaving Stirling Castle heading to France for negotiations. And John Damian suddenly appeared on the walls of Stirling Castle wearing his giant wings and declared that he would beat the delegation to Paris. He would jump off the walls and flap all the way to Paris. So he jumped off the walls and he promptly broke both of his legs. Yes. Now, he was paid a pension for the rest of his life by the king, because the king obviously quite liked him. But he declared that he knew why he had failed. He had failed for one very simple reason. He had used chicken's feathers. Chicken's famously a flightless bird. Yes. Yes. So he said that if he had only thought to use eagle's feathers, it would have worked fine. We don't think he ever tried again, thankfully. Not the smartest man, John Damian. The last thing down at the bottom there is a fairly modern use for whiskey. We have a great reference from 1505 of, again, the Rolls of the Exchequer, where it records Ein Flasket of Uisce Beha, wherewith to play cards. So the king was literally ordering whiskey to be produced so that he could have a card night with his mates, basically, which is just amazing. It's the most Scottish thing in the world. The king was obsessed with cards. He loved gambling, and he would regularly host card nights with all his favorite nobles, and he started ordering whiskey to be produced specifically for these card nights. So a very, very important man, King James IV. He basically sets the stall out for what the modern whiskey industry has become, essentially. Now, moving on from that on to us, a little history here of the sort of people that started Glenturret and the sort of area where Glenturret is located. By show of hands, first of all, stick your hand up if you have not been to Glenturret Distillery. Okay, not that many, that's good, that's good. You have to come and see us now that you've put your hand up. I'll come catch you at the end. We're located just outside of Crieff, just to the west of Crieff, on the road out to Comrie. And we're very linked with the history of the area. So just to go through some of these crests that I've got located up here. Top left here, we have the old crest of Strathearn, which is of course the area that we're located in. One of the real sort of forgotten important areas in Scottish history, Strathearn. Most importantly, the Earl of Strathearn for a while was the younger brother of King Robert III, who basically was the governor of Scotland during his lifetime. So that was seen as his power base around the Strathearn area. Later became the crest of the Drummonds, who were the Dukes of Perth, and really sort of controlled that whole area. Next to that, we have the original crest of Clan Murray. Now, Clan Murray had their origins in Tullybarden, around the village of Blackford, and later had several offshoot branches, including the Murrays of Mansfield, who still live in Scone Palace to this day. The main branch would later become the Murrays of Athol, and are now the Dukes of Athol, and have their seat up at Blair Castle. And that is their modern crest down at the bottom there, the Murrays of Athol. Now, the original crest contained 3 stars that you can see here, and that is still in the modern crest in the middle there. So that is the crest of Clan Murray. Now, the crest at the time hadn't quite become this, so it went from that to that. Now, the one that's associated with Glenturret are the Murrays of Auchtertyre. The Murrays of Auchtertyre started as a younger son of a Murray of Tullybarden. In the 1450s, they were granted some of the lands of the barony of Strathearn in their own right, and they became a sort of vassal of the barony of Strathearn, but still associated with the Tullybardens, and that is their particular crest there. So we've got the 3 silver stars, we've got the red from Strathearn, worked into the Murrays of Auchtertyre. And for those of you familiar with Crieff, on the road sign as you enter, this is what you see. This is the coat of arms of Crieff today, so it combines these 2 into the modern coat of arms. Now, the Murray clan does still exist, of course. Our branch, the Murrays of Auchtertyre, no longer exist as a sort of extant branch. But the Murrays themselves do exist still. This is the chieftain of Clan Murray, Bruce Murray, 12th Duke of Athol. He is a proud South African man who comes to Scotland once every sort of 2 or 3 years. It was a bit of a strange story. His father's second cousin, once removed, who was the last Scottish Duke of Athol, died without heirs in 1996. So they went all the way back up the line to the 3rd Duke, down his second son, and they found a South African farmer, basically. So he became the Duke of Athol. Now, he died in 2012, and then his son inherited the title and became the 12th Duke of Athol. So that is Bruce. Now, Bruce's son, Michael Murray, the Marquess of Tullybarden, he lives in London. So he's up quite frequently and attends lots of events. Now, what you can see them both wearing here is the officers' dress-down uniform of the Athol Highlanders. Presumably all familiar with the Athol Highlanders, mostly being from Perthshire. Europe's only private army in service to Clan Murray, based up at Blair Castle. So he is the commander-in-chief, and he is second in command. And then we've got this guy. I am a soldier in the Athol Highlanders, which is how I know so much about this. So that's me in my uniform there, alongside these guys. So I've basically spent my entire life talking about Clan Murray, which is quite easy. Although as a Thomson, it does feel like I'm betraying myself a little bit, but there we go. Now, Glenturret, we have worked little bits of Clan Murray into the modern crest of the distillery. So what you can see here is the 3 silver stars of Clan Murray in the distillery's crest. And if we go back to the Auchtertyre Murrays, they had a white St. George's cross with a red saltire over the top of it. So we decided to change that around a little bit and purely just make it the saltire from the Scotland flag. A couple of reasons behind this. We wanted it to be recognisable as a Scottish product, so we thought just putting the saltire on there was the best thing. The other part, of course, is that if we went with that one rather than that one, we would have had to ask permission from the Lord Lion to do that, essentially, and that involves lots of lawyers' letters and a big process and everything, so this just seemed easier, to be honest with you. Now, the distillery itself was founded, as I said, by a junior branch of Clan Murray, and this is some of this motley crew here. So we start with William Murray, who was the 3rd Baron Auchtertyre. William Murray was a staunch Jacobite, and he was captured during the 1715 Jacobite rebellion. Thankfully, the lands were not attainted. His cousin, the Duke of Athol, basically managed to get the government to relent a little bit and not take the lands off them, which was quite good. In response to that, his son, Sir Patrick Murray, became a staunch government man. So he is the one who is responsible for the foundation of Glenturret Distillery in 1763, and really he was able to do that because he remained loyal to the government, essentially. He was given more grants of land and he was given right to distill spirit because he kept loyal to the government, really. And then his son, Sir William Murray, the 5th Baron, he was responsible really for the running of the distillery in the early days, and then later the sale of the distillery into really what it is now. Now, in terms of their sort of history within the area, their original seat was Castle Cluggy. I had to correct one of our tour guides recently who kept calling it Castle Cludgy, which is not what you want to sell it to people as. Nip down Cludgy, it's lovely. Castle Cluggy sits on the banks of Loch Monyverd. If you've never been out to it, I'd recommend it. It's a lovely little walk along the north shore of the loch. It takes you out to the castle. A very well contested castle throughout time. There was tens of different battles took place at Castle Cluggy. In the 18th century, they moved up to Ochtertyre House, that sits on the hill overlooking the loch. They hosted Robert Burns at Ochtertyre House when he visited in the 1780s as well. That is now owned by Brian Souter of Stagecoach, Ochtertyre House. It's had various uses throughout the 20th century, including a school and all this kind of thing, but it's owned by Brian Souter today. Their last house was Aberturret. Now, Aberturret actually sits just across the river from Glenturret Distillery and is actually now owned by the distillery. So if you come and visit the distillery, this is where I put my little salesman hat on here. Come and visit the distillery, stay in our lovely 6-bedroom Victorian mansion, little private tour of the distillery, and then dinner in the 2 Michelin star restaurant. Doesn't that sound great, eh? See you all next weekend. We'll get that sorted for you. Now, some other areas of interest for the Ochtertyres. The house on the far side there was called Ruad Moor. Now, Ruad Moor, we're not entirely sure of the definition of Ruad Moor. If you look at it in its base definition, it means big red. Probably doesn't mean that, to be honest, because why would a Victorian Scottish person call their house Big Red? We think it's maybe an anglicised version of another name that means something like Big Beautiful Area or something like that. That was their hunting lodge up by Loch Turret, way up in the hills above Ochtertyre. And again, they hosted Robert Burns there in the 1780s as well. Unfortunately, it's no longer there because they actually flooded the whole valley to create the modern Loch Turret when they built the dam. So they dismantled the house when they did that. Now, we use the name Ruad Moor on site. That's what we call our peated Glenturret. So we have kept the name alive on site with the modern brand. And then you can see Loch Turret alongside it there as well, which is the water source for the distillery. Now, into the actual whiskey stuff in the area. There's a lot of small text here that you don't need to read, but the main thing for us is we know that in 1763, there was legal production happening on site at Glenturret Distillery. We have a record from the Exchequer that tells us that. But it seems to have been very intermittent. Now, we think today of a distillery being founded, and that's it, it's just in operation for the rest of time, basically. But at the time, it was a very different prospect. What would happen normally is some buildings would be set aside on an estate with a still put into it, and it would really only be when there was a good harvest that whiskey was actually produced. So we know in 1763 there was the estate distillery operating, but we know that several years after that, it was periods of not operating. Now, at this time, there was still illegal distillation happening on site as well. So we know that in 1796, a man called John Drummond was actually arrested for illegally producing spirit just across the river from the distillery. Now, what's quite funny, I actually only noticed this a couple of days ago. It lists here the man who arrested him. The local excise officer was a man called William Corbett, who was the general supervisor. Now, this caused much hilarity on site when I discovered this, because our head of security at Glenturret is called Stuart Corbett. They haven't changed as a family, the Corbetts. They're just always in everybody's business, you know. Not very popular people at the time, as you can imagine, excise officers. As I said, I grew up on a farm just outside Aberfeldy. We had a distillery on the farm until 1910, the Grantley Distillery, operated by something like 5 times great-grandfather's little brother actually murdered an excise man in the early 1800s. So you know, probably quite popular in the area for having done that, but yeah, not very popular men, excise officers, unfortunately. Now, the next big thing really is the early 1800s. The distillery seems to come out of ownership from the estate, and it passes into several farming families. Confusingly, in the early history of Glenturret, they're all called John or Hugh Drummond, but they're all different people. It's quite difficult to keep track at this time. So we know that there was actually 2 distilleries operating at the time. Where we are now, on one bank of the Turret, and then across the Turret, there was the Hosh Mill Distillery. Now, again, confusingly, we weren't called Glenturret at that point. We were called the Hosh Distillery. So you had the Hosh Distillery and the Hosh Mill Distillery, and they were different businesses operated by different people. The records get incredibly difficult to decipher at this time. For a period, it was actually an uncle and a nephew who were running the two distilleries alongside each other. Crieff was quite a big part of the whisky industry at that point. We are the only distillery still situated in Crieff, of course, but at that point there was actually 7 distilleries operating throughout the town. Again, those of you that know Crieff, where the co-op is located now, there was 2 distilleries actually within that area operating, one of which we believe might actually have been bigger than Glenturret currently is. So a huge amount of whisky being produced in the town at that point. Next big thing is the sale to the Drummonds of Culcreef. Now, Culcreef is still a farm. It's a much smaller farm today than it was back in the day. It took up quite a large space, Culcreef, back in the day. It's now, most of its land is now where the Crieff Hydro is located. So we obviously have a lot of connections to the hydro today, but we used to be owned by the same farm, essentially. 1825, we are then given a right by the Ochtertyre Murrays to use the water from the turret officially for use in production of the whisky. And that is the water that we still use for our whisky today. So the water to make Glenturret comes directly from Loch Turret. A lot of the tourists that come on site assume we pull it straight out the burn. We don't, we take it from the loch. There's a fairly obvious reason why we don't pull it straight out the burn. We can't control if a sheep's died a mile upstream, essentially. Whereas we know it's going to be clean if it comes straight from the loch, basically. So it comes straight from there. Now, into the early 1800s, we get up to these 2 men here. Assuming we all know who this is. This is, of course, Sir Walter Scott. And then over here we have King George IV. These 2 really are responsible for the creation of the modern Scotch whisky industry. Early whisky legislation really felt very patchwork. So 1644, we have the first ever tax on Scotch whisky set by the Parliament in Edinburgh. The equivalent today would be 9 pence on a gallon. Absolutely fantastic. Let's bring those taxes back. That sounds great. It's a lot more than that these days. So that was the first one. 1784, we have a piece of legislation called the Wash Act. And the Wash Act is what defined the difference between Highland whisky and Lowland whisky. And the line that they drew across the map from the Forth of Clyde to the Forth of Tay is the line that we still follow today to separate the Highlands from the Lowlands. Nothing like an Englishman deciding what the Highlands and the Lowlands is, right? Drawing a line arbitrarily on the map, basically. Now, what they said was that Highland distilleries could pay a slightly lower rate of tax, but they were not allowed to send their whisky to the Lowlands. Whereas Lowland distilleries, they had to pay higher tax, but they could send their whisky to England. So if you were a Highland whisky producer, your market was your local area, basically. If you were a Lowland whisky producer, you could send it everywhere. However, it was regarded at the time that Highland whisky was much better, because the Lowland distilleries wanted to produce as much whisky as they possibly could, so we're using these massive, giant stills that basically gave you no reaction with the copper and didn't remove any of the flavor that copper strips out. Now, what copper does is it takes away flavor that our palate picks up as like acidic and sulfuric almost. So these Lowland whiskies would have tasted like someone essentially squeezing a piece of lemon directly onto your tongue and then slapping a bit of ham on top of it. It would not have been particularly pleasant. Whereas the Highland distilleries had these tiny little stills. They were all lit by just a fire underneath them. Got loads of copper contact, and they would have been these lovely, sweet vanilla, toffee, citrus characters coming through from them. So Highland whiskey was more sought after, but it was harder to get. And if you got it in the Lowlands, you probably had to break the law to get it, essentially. Now, all that changed with the visit of King George IV. So there had been no sitting monarch visit Scotland since 1651, and then George IV visited in 1822. It was all stage managed by Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott was the king of propaganda, basically. He managed to convince George IV that he was as much of a Stuart as Bonnie Prince Charlie was. Incredible, absolutely incredible piece of work. He convinced him that he was the returning Scottish hero, essentially, when he came up to Scotland. George was fully ready to believe this, so he got himself decked out in this huge, big tartan outfit. If you've been to the Palace of Holyrood House, it's on display in there. Now, the official portrait showed George as a Highland hero. The unofficial portrait, which I would recommend you look up because it's very funny, showed George as dressed like a pig, basically, with a kilt on, essentially. The problem that George had with his kilt was George didn't like his knees. Now, at that point, the kilt was not cut to the middle of the knee as it is today. The kilt was cut to here, just above the knee. So George didn't like his knees. So he decided to wear a pair of pink hose underneath his kilt to cover up his knees. Now, for anyone familiar with Royal Stuart tartan, it is bright red. So he's wearing a red jacket, he's wearing a red coat, essentially. He's wearing a bright red kilt and then bright pink hose that, rather than finishing just below the knee as they do today, came all the way up to the top of his thighs. He looked absolutely ridiculous when he came to Scotland. The other part of it was, this is a bit mean, but George's nickname when he was the Prince of Wales was the Prince of Wales, rather than the Principality, the large ocean-based mammal, because George was rather a big man. So he turned up, huge big man, bright red jacket, bright red kilt, pink socks. Maybe not the best, maybe not the best. What it did do, though, was it brought Scottish culture to the fore. Nobody had really been wearing kilts since Culloden, and nobody in the Lowlands had been associating themselves really with Highland whisky in high society. It would have been brandy, cognac, claret, would have been what high society was drinking, and maybe a little bit of gin as well. But George IV asked for whisky while he was here, and he wanted to try Highland whisky because he'd heard down in London that that was better than Lowland whisky. I always picture the scene of George sitting at dinner, and he says to someone, "You got any Highland whisky? I'd love to try some." And they all have to go, whoa. They've all got some in their room, right? But they have to pretend they don't. It'd be a little bit like the king going somewhere today and going, "Anybody got any heroin? I've heard this heroin stuff is fantastic." So some Highland whisky was produced somewhere. Someone's dog had some, presumably. The king tried it and pronounced that it was absolutely fantastic. Now, George only lived another 8 years, but he actually would order Highland whisky regularly after that to be sent down to London. So the following year, the government introduced something called the Act to Eliminate Illicit Distillation. And what it did was it took away the Wash Act law that said that Highland distillers paid more tax and that they couldn't ship to the Lowlands. So after that, Highland distillers boomed, basically. And Glenturret was the same. We more than doubled in size over the next 10 years because of this. And that wasn't until 1828. 1828, and I put this in because I've got a funny story connected to it. 1828, there was a flood at the distillery so bad that it actually knocked over the stills, and we had to get the stills repaired before we could go back to making whiskey. Now, the reason I put this in was I was doing some reading recently, and I found this little bit about the flood in 1828. And I thought, I wonder if our distillery manager knows that. He's worked at the distillery for 30-odd years, and what tends to happen is I do a whole load of research, I find a really cool thing, and I go to Ian and go, "Ian, did you know this?" And he goes, "Yeah." Should have just asked him. So I told him this, and I said, "Ian, did you know we had a catastrophic flood in 1828 that washed away the stills and meant they had to get repaired and we had to replace all this equipment?" And he went, "Oh, God, wish you hadn't told me that." It turns out, that morning, he had a meeting with SEPA. And SEPA told him that we sit on a once-in-200-year floodplain. Yes. I had just told him that the last flood was 197 years ago. Yes. So we might be looking for a distillery manager in 2.5 years, because I don't think he wants to stick around for that. Now, what I love about this is it then takes us to our next owner. Shortly after the flood, this lovely couple here, John and Janet McCallum, purchased the distillery. Now, this picture is amazing, right? That is their wedding day. Don't they look so happy? Love's young dream. Now, of course, at that point, you wouldn't have bought a wedding dress. You would have just worn your best dress for your wedding. So she's wearing her Sunday best, is Janet there. We were actually given this picture by Amanda Stevenson, who's their great-great-granddaughter, who lives in Manchester, and had the picture hanging in her wall. So she sent it up to us a few months ago. Now, John McCallum was our longest-serving owner. He owned the distillery from 1845 all the way until 1873. What I love about this, though, is this little excerpt that I found. Now, John was selling the distillery in the early 1870s, and he wrote this whole piece about the distillery in attempt to sell it. Now, my favourite part about this is, let me see if I can find it. Where is it? "My distillery is not affected by floods." Liar. He only bought the place in the 1840s, and it had been so badly flooded in 1828 they had to basically start again. But that was 50 years later, and nobody would remember by that point, basically. My other part about this is we have a wonderful sustainability officer on site, a woman called Lucy Armstrong. Lucy is actually currently the best sustainability officer in the Scotch whisky industry. It's not my opinion, she's won several awards to back this up. And again, it says somewhere in here, where is it again? There we go. Consume yearly 200 tons of coal, make about 20 tons of ash, which are mixed with the excrements of the work people and used for manure. Sent that on to Lucy and was like, right, here's a wee sustainability initiative for you here. Wasn't keen for some reason, wasn't keen. Now, the other part that I think is really cool about this is it shows actually how small we are and how we've retained this smallness over the years. Right at the bottom there, it says 22,000 gallons were produced when John was selling the distillery, which is equal to just over 100,000 litres. In 2019, that was our production output, was 100,000 litres. So between 1873 and 2019, we actually hadn't expanded the distillery at all. It was completely the same. Now, we have now done a little bit of work on that. Last year, we did 356,000 litres, which is the biggest year in the history of the distillery. And this year, the goal is 440,000 litres to be produced on site. Now, we haven't put loads of new equipment in place to do that. We've basically just started being more efficient. In 2019, we did 5 production runs a week. Now, for context, I used to work at Aberfeldy Distillery, as I said. They do about 24. We did 5. Last year, we did 10 production runs a week. The goal for this year is 13 production runs a week, and that'll get us up to that higher number. We're bringing a lot of staff on site, obviously, to try and achieve that. But I think that's amazing. The small amount of growth in that time, I think, is pretty cool. Now, the next big innovation in Scotch whisky is this man. This guy is called Aeneas Coffey. Aeneas Coffey was an Irish excise officer, and he was visiting distilleries all over the country as an excise controller. Now, he saw a new design of a still that had been implemented mostly in Scotland at this time. This thing here, this is called a continuous or a column still. Now, it was invented by a man called Robert Steen, who was from Preston Pans originally. And what it allowed for was a continuous process of distillation. So the problem with pot stills that single malt distilleries use to make whiskey is you put a batch in, you turn it into spirit, clean the still, and then you put your next batch in, and it's very stop-start. Continuous distillation basically allows for washing one side, spirit out the other side, and you can keep that going 24/7 with very little work needing done on it. The problem with the original design of still is they had a habit of blowing up. Now, that wasn't great, considering you're working with alcohol that's 94.5%. It's not really what you want, to be honest with you. So Aeneas Coffey, he saw this design that other distilleries were working with, and he actually changed the design, perfected it, and then patented it. So that became the coffee still. Now, what the coffee still allowed for was the production of a lighter, sweeter style of whiskey that we now call grain whiskey. Now, the next innovation was to take that grain whiskey, to mix it with single malt whiskey, and to produce blended whiskey. So without the invention of the coffee still, we never would have had blended whiskey, basically. Blended whiskey was started by this man here, called Andrew Usher. Andrew Usher was a spirit merchant based in Edinburgh. Anyone's familiar with the south side of Edinburgh, there's a pub called Pear Tree, which is part of sort of Edinburgh University's student union area. Confusingly enough, Pear Tree is where Andrew Usher's original office was, not the pub next door, which is called Usher's. It's not that one, it's the one next door to Usher's, basically. So he came up with this idea of mixing malt whiskies with grain whiskies to produce blended Scotch whisky. The idea was that you could then control the flavour and you could have a consistent product. Whereas before, distilleries were just emptying a barrel, putting it in bottle, shipping it out. There was no consistency, no quality control over the product at all, essentially. So his first blend was called Usher's Green Stripe, and that kicked off blended Scotch whisky. If you haven't heard of Andrew Usher, you have heard of a piece of his legacy, probably been to a piece of his legacy. One thing he hated about Edinburgh was there weren't any good concert venues. So when he died, he left money to the city, and they built Usher Hall. So that's why it's called Usher Hall, as it's named after him. So another thing we have the whiskey industry to thank is the creation of Usher Hall. Now, blended whiskey really, though, had its heart in Perth, and this is why it's important to the history of Glenturret. You might recognize a few of these characters. So up at the top here, we have Arthur Bell, the founder of Bell's Scotch whisky. This one here is called Matthew Gloag. Matthew Gloag was the founder of Gloag's, which then went on to become Famous Grouse. Down at the bottom here, we have a man from the most exciting village in Scotland, Dull, up in Perthshire. It's where my grandmother's from, actually. My grandmother's a dull woman, as we like to say. It's not very nice. She's a very nice woman, my grandmother. So that's John Dewar. He was from Dull, moved to Perth to set up his blenders as well. And then the forgotten one of the four, this man is called Peter Thomson. So Peter Thomson set up Ben Eagle's blend and Thomson's blend. Peter Thomson is my great-great-grandfather's nephew, because again, there's not that many of us in Perthshire, so we're all related. So these four men between them created Perth as the powerhouse of blended Scotch whisky by starting these four companies. Now, the great thing for us, of course, was we were incredibly close to Perth, and in the 1850s, there was a railway line built that connected Crieff to Perth. So that allowed for whisky to go straight from the distillery straight to Perth. So in the early days of the blended industry, Glenturret was an integral part of all of these blends. We have record books from all four of these guys that show every single one of them was holding Glenturret in their warehouses to be used in blending. So that's really what got the distillery into the position that it really ended in. Now, 1873, we are then sold to a man called Thomas Stewart. Now, what Thomas Stewart did was he gave us our name. Before 1873, we had been known, as I said, as the Hosh. The Hosh is the name for the whole area around Glenturret. It's a beautiful Gaelic word. It's Chois originally, which has become Hosh. The literal translation of Hosh is foot, which doesn't sound great. You're going to try the foot whiskey. It doesn't really sound very good. But what it means really is we sit at the foot of the Glen, is where it comes from, essentially. Thomas Stewart decided at this time, when distilleries were becoming a little bit more prominent as businesses, that wasn't a really catchy name. So he renamed us as Glenturret, which is obviously the name for the valley that we sit in as well. Now, the other thing that happened during Thomas Stewart's time, which is fantastic, is we were visited by this man. Now, he was called Alfred Barnard. Fantastic book out there written by Alfred Barnard, which I would recommend reading, called The Whisky Distilleries of the United Kingdom. This is before sub-editors, when they would trim things down a little bit. What he did, Alfred Barnard, was while working for Harper's Gazette, he travelled the whole of the UK and he visited every single distillery that was in operation at the time. He met my great-great-grandfather, who was running the family distillery at this time, called Donald Thomson. What I love about this is he gave a little description of Donald. He referred to him as a stalwart young Scotchman, renowned for his whisky, his farming, and his remarkable height. Now, difficult to tell, because I'm up here and you're down there. I'm 6'6", so you can kind of see where that's come from in the family. I believe Donald was 6'2", which in the 1870s was an absolute giant of a man. I refer to my dad as Wee Sandy, because he's only 6'1". I don't quite know what happened to him, but yeah, I'm 6'6", so that's where that came from. Now, what was great about Barnard was he gave a full description of the distillery. He also drew a little picture of the distillery as well, which I think is absolutely brilliant. If you've been to Glenturret Distillery, this is the car park. This is where you would enter off the road, just here. All these buildings are still here. That's the actual distillery itself. And then this area here, this is where the shop and the restaurant are located today. So very, very similar to what we have today. The problem with Alfred Barnard's visit is he was given a piece of incorrect information. Alfred Barnard was told that Glenturret was founded in 1775. So he put that in his notes, that went into the article, and that then was published into the book. And nobody thought to question it, basically. So for the next 130, 150 years, that just became the thing for Glenturret, and everybody said Glenturret was built in 1775. Nobody thought to do any further research on that until 2019. So in 2019, we wanted to verify this claim of 1775. We got into as many records and archives as we can, and finally in the Scottish National Records, we found this roll of the Exchequer from 1763 that mentions the distillery being operational. So we know we're actually at least 12 years older than Alfred Barnard thought we were. Now, this was great. 1775 already made us the oldest distillery in Scotland. 1763 just makes that even further. It was a bit of a nightmare, though, because every single piece of branded merchandise that we had ever produced said 1775 on it. Everything was now out of date. If you'd come to Glenturret in 2020, you could have got yourself an entire wardrobe of out-of-date branded merchandise that was all half off, basically. So we had to redesign the label, all these things, and take this new date of 1763. Now, the next big innovation for us was new owners. Again, we had a lot of owners throughout our history. The Mitchell brothers, they were blenders based in Falkirk. And what's interesting about this time is it shows how different whiskey is today compared to back then. So in their advert here, they have said, finest old Irish and Scotch whiskies. Incredibly common at that time that if you bought a blended Scotch whiskey, it was a blend of Scotch and Irish whiskey. There was very little control over that. Now, in the early 1900s, the Irish took a bit of a, I'm trying to say here, they got a bit bored of us, basically. Irish was becoming more prominent than Scotch as a whiskey category, especially in North America. And the Irish basically put a stop to this. And they said, right, we're Irish whiskey, you're Scotch whiskey, we're going to do our own things now, basically. That's when the spelling was set in stone as well. Up until then, whiskey was pretty interchangeable, whether you had an E or didn't have an E. But in the early 1900s, the Irish said, we're having the E, you're not having the E, basically. And that's where it came from. So don't spell whiskey with an E, because that makes the Irish happy. And after what they did to our poor rugby team yesterday, I was there, it was horrible, absolutely horrible. That is the last thing we want, all right? But at that time, very, very common. So most of our whiskey in the 1890s into the early 1900s would have actually been mixed with Irish whiskey to produce blended Scotch whiskey. A lot of people will tell you it's sacrilege today. Very quick little story on that. My family's records have a drink that the family shop used to make in Perth that was called Irish whiskey. It was not Irish whiskey. The thought was at the time that Irish whiskey was sweeter and fruitier. So what Peter Thomson did to try and replicate the feel of Irish whiskey being sweeter and fruitier was he put Scotch whiskey in a barrel, he mixed in brandy and pineapple juice, yeah, and then he left it in the barrel for 6 months and then he would bottle it because they thought that gave the tropical feel that Irish whiskey gave. Quite amazing to get pineapple juice in the early 1900s, you would imagine, and the thought to then stick that in a barrel of Scotch whiskey is absolutely mad, but there you go. Now, this one here, this is the earliest photo we have of the distillery. Now, just for a bit of comparison, keep an eye on that chimney there, right? So that chimney is there. So it's from a slightly different angle of the distillery, but it shows what Alfred Barnard saw. Now, we know this picture was taken before the winter of 1893. And the reason we know that is that that chimney blew down in the winter of 1893, so it has to have been before then, basically. Huge storm that destroyed some of the buildings and blew the chimney down. This one here, this is the oldest picture we have of production staff at Glenturret Distillery. It was taken in 1905. Now what's amazing about this is we got this picture a couple of years ago. When we got it, we only knew one name, George Newlands at the front there. Well, we knew a second name, we knew the dog was called Fly. That's the important one, right? We didn't know the rest of the names. We have discovered the rest of the names that we know purely by people coming into the distillery and going, that's my grandfather. It's brilliant, absolutely love that. And it's one of the great things about still being a little local distillery is you get these interactions. I was lucky enough to meet the granddaughter of Mr. Comrie here only about a month ago. I had a lovely conversation with her where she told me all about her grandfather's history and all that kind of thing. So we've written that down at the distillery now, and that's in the records, which is brilliant to be able to do things like that. And then we get to the bad times. So we've just talked about blending, and how blending is great, and how it really kicked off the industry, and then the industry fell apart, basically. Early 1900s, we had disaster after disaster. So the First World War was obviously a pretty big disaster. We then had, in 1912, shortly before the war, something called the Pattison crash. Now, the Pattison brothers were two brothers based in Leith, and they were whiskey brokers, and they also produced their own blend called Pattison whiskey. Now, they were the biggest players in the Scotch whisky industry. They had invested in Dewars, in Johnny Walker, and Buchanan's. They had their fingers in every pie. Problem was, absolute charlatans, the Pattison brothers. What they were doing was they were buying one cask of whiskey and then selling it to two people, because they knew that actually with the amount of cask trading that was going on, only one person was actually going to come and look for it, essentially. And then what basically happened was everything just collapsed at once. Everyone came to look for all their casks of whiskey at once, and the whole thing fell apart. They went bankrupt, and they essentially almost pulled the whole whiskey industry down with them, because everyone was financially tied to them. Now, in response to this, the big blending companies, so Dewars, Buchanan's, Johnny Walker, Chivas Regal, they all started to form conglomerates after this. And that is what led to the creation of Diageo. because all these big blending companies were almost about to go out of business, so they all had to join together to survive. So it's basically thanks to the Patterson brothers that we have big names in the whiskey industry really still going today. The other two parts, of course, American Prohibition. Terrible idea, absolutely terrible idea. They reckon there was more alcohol consumed in America during Prohibition than before Prohibition, because the government didn't benefit on tax money from it. Awful idea. And then Mr. Mustachioed man there, David Lloyd George. Lloyd George was a teetotaler, put in charge of the Exchequer. And what people don't necessarily realize is that we were this far away from Prohibition in this country as well. But the way Lloyd George did it was to ramp up the taxes. And this led to the closure of over half of Scotland's distilleries, was Lloyd George's taxes. I'm particularly bitter about it because it led to the closure of my family's distillery. Never put a Welsh teetotaler in charge of the Exchequer, right? It's not a good idea. They get ideas above their station. So at this time, Glenturret unfortunately closed. So 1923, the distillery fell silent, as we say. There was still work going on site until 1935. There was a cask management program looking after the spirit on site, but the distillery ceased all production in 1923. The Mitchell brothers did retain ownership, and they wrote to the government every year asking for a tax relief, and they said that if we get this tax relief, we will immediately reopen the distillery. Nothing came, unfortunately. 1957, the distillery was purchased by James Fairley, local businessman, and he set about restoring the distillery, bringing it back to life, and it finally still ran for the first time in 1960. So we'd had 37 years of no production on site when Mr. Fairley restarted the distillery. Subsequent owners throughout time, we then had Remy Cointreau as our next owners. You're all familiar with Cointreau, I'm sure, the orange liqueur. They owned us for something like 10 years. After that, Edrington. Now, Edrington were formerly a Perthshire-based company. They're now based in Glasgow, and they owned Glenturret for just over 20 years. They're the ones that really created the modern Glenturret as a brand, as people would know it. Now, they are also the ones that tied us into Famous Grouse. So Edrington own Michelin, they own Highland Park, Glenrothes, and they own Famous Grouse as well. The reason they tied us to Famous Grouse was Famous Grouse was a bigger brand internationally than Glenturret. No one really outside of Scotland was that aware of Glenturret when Edrington took us over, but people were aware of Famous Grouse. Michelin is a big brand. Glenrothes is in the middle of nowhere. It's not in Glenrothes in Fife, it's Rothes up in Speyside, Glenrothes Distillery. And Highland Park was on Orkney. But what they wanted was to create a visitor centre for the Famous Grouse brand. So they decided to base it at Glenturret, because of course we're just over an hour from Glasgow and Edinburgh, and we could get a lot of visitors to us. So we never actually made Famous Grouse on site at the distillery. We made Glenturret single malt, but the visitor centre was Famous Grouse. Now, it's tricky with things like this. I said I've worked in a couple of sort of small local distilleries, and what I've always found is that local people get very passionate about it, and understandably they don't like it when things change with their local distillery. Now, in 2002, when this was announced that Famous Grouse was going to basically rebrand Glenturret as the Famous Grouse Distillery, there was outcry in the local area that this was going to happen. And then in 2019, when it was announced that Famous Grouse had sold the distillery and the Famous Grouse branding would be coming off the distillery, there was outcry in the local area that this was going to happen, because people had got used to it by that point. I had a local recently actually get very angry with me, and they said that we were destroying history by taking away the Famous Grouse name from the distillery. And right, you're not supposed to argue with guests, right? So I had an informed discussion with the guests, and I said, well, look, there's two ways to look at this. First of all, we didn't take the name down. They sold us, basically. So we can't keep the name up anymore anyway. And the second way to look at it is this year is our 262nd birthday as a distillery. We were Famous Grouse for 17 of those 262 years. So what this has actually allowed us to do is to get back to the history of Glenturret. All the stuff I've told you today about the early Murray clan involvement and about all these different owners taking place and bankrupting the place and the place getting flooded and all that, we didn't know any of that when we were owned by Famous Grouse. We've done all this research subsequently, so it's allowed us really to tell the story of Glenturret, which is brilliant. Now, one thing I just want to pick out here is this little bright-eyed, ginger-haired boy here. This picture was taken in 2002, when that little bright-eyed, ginger-haired boy there was the maintenance man at Glenturret Distillery. 23 years later, he is now the distillery manager. So that is Ian Rennick, started as part-time maintenance guy and is now distillery manager. Anyone who's from Crieff or knows the Crieff area might know some Rennicks. They're a very big family in the area. And Ian is he's a proper local man. He's a very good man. There he is there with his little ginger hair as well, which is quite funny. He's a very nice man, Ian. Now these are the brands that were created throughout this time with Edrington being owners. And this was the last brand that Edrington created of Glenturret. So again, this is what you might recognize Glenturret as how it might look from what you've seen it. Very traditional bottles with 1775 etched onto the glass there. That was a bit annoying. We couldn't even use the old bottles when we discovered this date because it had it etched right on the glass, which was fantastic. And then we have these two men. These two are our current owners. They each own 50% of the distillery. This is Hans-Jörg Wyss. Now, Hans-Jörg Wyss is a Swiss-American billionaire philanthropist. Hans-Jörg is responsible for developing most of the technology that allows for things like hip replacements and knee replacements and stuff like that don't set off metal detectors in airports. That was a big part of what he did. So he's become a billionaire off the back of doing that. The main thing he does now is runs what's called the Wyss Foundation, and the Wyss Foundation wants to save the planet. So he's worth about 3 billion, Hans-Jörg, and he uses that money to buy up areas of the Amazon rainforest and rewild them and do all these amazing things. So his focus with Glenturret is making whiskey in a more sustainable way, and we've cut our carbon footprint in half since he took over, which is fantastic. The other owner is this man here, Silvio Denz. Silvio is Swiss, and he is most famous as the chairman of Lalique. Well familiar with Lalique, French crystal manufacturer, yeah. They own several vineyards already, and then when the opportunity came up to buy the distillery, Silvio jumped at it, got Hans-Jörg on board, and they each bought half of the distillery. So his focus is on more the luxury side of things, and we'll come on to the restaurant in a second for that. This is how we now look. So between 2019 and 2020, we went from that to that. A little bit different. The idea was to have a luxury feel to the whiskey. The bottles are designed by Lalique. Very important distinction here. Designed by Lalique, not produced by Lalique. If you're familiar with Lalique, if they actually made the bottles, it would be about £5,000 for our cheapest bottle of whiskey, which obviously we don't want. But what they do have is on the bottom of each bottle, it is stamped, designed by Lalique. So it does carry the Lalique name on the bottle. The focus now is on high quality, aged single malt in the best casks we can possibly put it in. So Glenturret is more expensive than it used to be, and it is more expensive than the average whiskey on the market, but there are so many reasons behind that. Even in terms of quantity, you take our 12-year-old, for example. That is, I'm not just saying this because I work there, that is one of the best whiskeys in the world right now, our 12-year-old. If you look at our 12-year-old and you compare it to, let's say, Aberfeldy 12-year-old, which is a lovely whiskey, their 12-year-old's about 40 odd pounds, ours is 70 pounds. Now, there's a couple of reasons behind that. That is a whiskey that is produced in continuous production, Aberfeldy 12. We do yearly releases with our whiskey. We don't just release it in a continuous thing. Each yearly batch is slightly different. It's a bit more like wine. And each of those releases will only be about 30,000 bottles. So if you like the 2024 version of Glenturret 12-year-old, you have to buy it, basically, because the 2025 version will be a slightly different cask makeup and will actually be a different whiskey. The other part of that, as I said, is the casks that we're using. 90% of the casks used in the Scotch whisky industry are American oak ex-bourbon casks. Now, they're not cheap, but they're not that expensive for a bourbon cask. Almost 100% of what we use for our whiskey is sherry casks from Spain. These are like 2 or 3 times the cost of a bourbon cask. Now, we're using them because that is the right thing for the flavor of our whiskey. And that's the ethos of the distillery now, is do the right thing to make the whiskey taste nice, essentially. Sounds pretty self-explanatory, right? Make nice whiskey. But that's really what we're about. It doesn't matter if it costs a little bit more, as long as it makes the whiskey taste good, essentially. I heard you talking about this beforehand. This is what we're very famous for. So, a little funny story before we get onto the restaurant and finish up. Towser. This is Towser. This is her as she looks now, immortalized in copper, I think, or bronze. Towser was our distillery cat from 1963 until 1987. She lived for 23 years and 11 months at Glenturret Distillery. Very common thing, distillery cats throughout history. Obviously, you're dealing with a large amount of grain, so that attracts mice. so you have a cat. Not a problem these days because the grain is kept in a stainless steel container. Whereas if I skip back to that picture, you can see the grain was delivered in sacks, and it was just kept in the sacks in the corner of a room. Essentially. Whereas now it comes in a lorry and gets delivered straight into a stainless steel container. Thomson is believed to have killed 28,899 mice during her lifetime. Now, there was a very scientific method that they got this number. She would supposedly eat the entire mouse, but she would never eat the tail. She would leave the tails on the floor of the still house. Someone from the Guinness Book of World Records came to the distillery. They spent 1 week at the distillery, counting the daily kill count. Yes, I always like to picture the Guinness offices in London. They all get their assignment for the week. I'm off to Manchester to see how many marshmallows a toddler can stuff in his mouth. Where are you going, Jimmy? I'm away to Scotland counting mouse tails. Not great. Now, what did happen, though, basically, was he would spend 5 minutes in the morning counting mouse tails, and then he would just get given whiskey, basically. So I'm sure he had an okay week. He got an average of 3 a day, extrapolated that over 23 years and 11 months, and got 28,899. So she is an official world record holder, Thomson. The exact wording of the record is the most mice killed by one cat in a lifetime. They don't put her in the book anymore, because the book is marketed at children these days, and children don't like the thought of 30,000 dead mice. They're very soft these days, children, aren't they? Very, very soft. I used to get paid 15 pence for every rat I killed by my grandfather, but apparently children don't like doing things like that anymore. But anyway. Now, Thomson is no longer with us, as I said. She died in 1987, but she is buried on site at the distillery, and we have this little statue of her just outside our shop. We do still have cats, though. These are the 2 boys we have today. Very, very inventively named Glenturret. Took a long time to come up with that one, let me tell you. They're both about 10. Turret's 10 in May, Glen's 10 in July. They were born on local farms, brought to the distillery as kittens, and they've spent their whole life living at the distillery. Glen is sitting there in front of their cat flap into the still house, because they spend their time sleeping under the stills, because it's nice and warm under the stills, of course. Turret, with his nice little hat on here, is actually quite a good mouser, to be fair to him. Glen is a lover, not a fighter. He's not interested, absolutely not interested. He has a bed on my desk where he spends most of his time, but Turret actually does mousing. They are the friendliest cats in the world, because in summer we get over 300 people a day at the distillery, and every single one of those people wants to pet them and give them a treat, and they are more than happy to oblige. Glen is currently on a diet, because the local vet described him recently as incredibly overweight, because people come to the distillery to do a tour and they bring cat treats with them just to feed Glen and Turret. So, on a diet at the moment. Now, these 2 men here, these are the guys that are shaping Glenturret going ahead. On the left here, we have Bob Dalgarno. Bob Dalgarno was whiskey maker at Michelin for 25 years. Now, he subsequently left Michelin, and now he does the same job at Glenturret. So his job is to take casks from our warehouse, where we have over 7,000 casks, figure out what can go together to create the releases that we put out on the market. It's a hugely important part of the process. And then next to him is that young man with the ginger hair, without the ginger hair now. That is Ian Rennick, as I said, our distillery manager. Now, to finish us off, what we've all been waiting for, the restaurant. We opened a restaurant in July 2021. And the Lalique style, we wanted it to be a fine dining restaurant, because that's what Lalique does. It has seen an extraordinary amount of success since then. This is our chef, a young man called Mark Donald. Mark's from Glasgow originally, but he's trained in various places all over the world, Paris, Copenhagen, Sydney, and London. And he picked up an amazing palate and an amazing sort of knowledge of fine dining experiences in that time. Now, he was appointed Glenturret chef before the restaurant even opened, so he set up the restaurant as to what it is now. So it opened in July 2021. In February 2022, we were awarded a Michelin star. Now, that is the fastest acquisition of a Michelin star in Scotch history. 7 months from the day the door opened to the day we got a Michelin star. Absolutely amazing. 2 years later, 2.5 years since the restaurant had opened, we were awarded a second Michelin star. Now again, that is the fastest in Scottish history to get from opening to 2 stars, and we are only one of two Michelin star restaurants in the whole of Scotland. There are only 3 Scottish chefs who have been awarded 2 Michelin stars in the whole history of Michelin. Andrew Fairley, Mark Donald, and Gordon Ramsay. That's quite an amazing group for Mark to be in. For someone who's still quite a young chef, He's in his late 30s, Mark. So for him to be in that group right now is absolutely amazing. Last year, we were named as the 11th best restaurant in the UK and the number 1 in Scotland after only 2.5 years of operation. I say we have 2 Michelin stars. The Michelin Awards are tonight. We're not aiming for a 3rd star. We're absolutely not aiming for a 3rd star. The work required to get from 1 to 2 is big, from 2 to 3 is massive. So we're aiming for retention this year. So we'll all be sitting watching that very, very anxious. But if you haven't been to the restaurant, I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's absolutely amazing. We do an a la carte lunch, Friday and Saturday, and then Wednesday to Saturday is a tasting menu for dinner. It's a 15 to 17 course tasting menu. It's fine dining, but with lots of Scotch twists. I'll tell you about one course in particular, which is my favourite course. All it says on the menu is tatty scone. That's all it says, right? You're sitting there thinking, I've come to a 2 Michelin star restaurant, I'm getting a tatty scone. What they do is they take the batter from a tatty scone and they steam it into a dumpling. And they fill it with this like creamy potato filling. And then on top is a layer of Wagyu beef carpaccio, then a thinly sliced layer of truffle, and they put a little spoonful of caviar on top of it. And you pick it up and you eat it all in one go, and it is the single nicest thing I have ever eaten, all right? It's absolutely fantastic. It's an odd offering for a distillery to have. We are the only distillery in the world that has a Michelin star restaurant, so it is a very odd offering for a distillery to have. What it's done for the rest of us on site is it has raised the bar for the rest of us, because we've got a 2 Michelin star kitchen on site. The rest of us, everything that we do, we have to be trying to hit that level, basically. So, that's Glenturret Distillery. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
I'll kick off with the first question.
Go for it.
What have you got in there?
Remember how I said I love the 12-year-olds? No, that's just water. That is water that I filled up from my tap this morning, so I can actually say it is a Glenturret product, because that water has also come from Loch Turret. So, close enough.
I thought it might be.
Yeah.
Questions, please.
Have I done too good a job? Oh my God.
I was interested in what you said about the decline of whisky production in the 1920s. But, I mean, Lloyd George, in the First World War, wanted to discourage workers from drinking alcohol, and he brought in the 3-year rule.
That's right, yeah. So 1916, a rule was brought in to classify Scotch whisky as being a product matured for a minimum of 2 years. And 1917, that rule was up to a minimum of 3 years, which is the rule that we still follow today. And the idea was, to stop distilleries just pumping out cheap hooch that anyone could buy, essentially. What it accidentally did was made Scotch whisky a premium product, which, great, we're very happy about that these days. At the time, the high-end producers, Johnny Walker, Dewar's, things like that, they were already guaranteeing a period of 2-year maturation, so it basically brought the rest of the industry in line with them, essentially.
Could I just follow up? How high was the tax that they introduced in the 1920s to discourage people from drinking?
Couldn't tell you the exact figure, to be honest, but it was one of the few occasions where it was actually higher than it is today, which is a lot. It's something like 74% of the cost of a bottle can quite often be laid down to tax, and it was higher than that, basically. The other thing they did, which they don't do as much of today, was they taxed grain at a much higher rate as well. So we were basically paying 2 taxes. We were paying tax on our grain acquisition and a tax on spirit production as well, which was crippling, essentially. Anyone under about 500,000 litres essentially couldn't make enough whiskey to survive. And these days, about 20% of the industry is under 500,000 litres. So all would have gone out of business, basically. No problem.
It's just talk about the restaurant.
Yes.
What the capacity is and the booking.
So,
The big waiting list.
we've changed it a little bit recently, actually. Our capacity last year was 26 covers for dinner. We've actually brought it down to 16. And the idea is we want a more intimate feel, and we want the staff to be able to spend longer with the guests, essentially. So 16 covers capacity right now. We can increase to 26 for like private bookings, because it's shorter courses and all that. This year, we're trying something a bit different this year. The traditional thing you do with fine dining is you open 3 months rolling. This year, we're actually opening for the whole year, essentially, for taking bookings. You would be surprised. I think when people think, oh, it's a 2 Michelin star restaurant, it's fine dining, you're going to have to book 6 months in advance. Absolutely not. Peak summer, you will struggle to get a table on a Saturday, normally. But as I said, we're open Wednesday and Thursday as well. So like, I have insider information on this because my partner is the bookings manager for the restaurant, which is very handy if I ever want a table. It's quite nice. Very, very rare that if you want a table on a Wednesday or a Thursday, and sometimes a Friday, you can't get one, basically. Obviously, if you think a 2 Michelin star restaurant in London, they're going to have a very full calendar. But because of where we are, it really is Fridays and Saturdays that are hard to get tables.
Thank you. It's a question of transport. We don't have a car. We're beholden on public transport only. Yep. How do we get to Glenturret, please?
The number 15. So, nice and easy. The number 15 drops off at our road end, basically. The one that goes out to Comrie, and it's a 3-minute walk out to the distillery from the number 15 route. And if you're coming for dinner, we can help you book a taxi.
This might be a bit of a plank question, but I'll ask it anyway. For instance, your 12-year-old whiskey, you only produce 100,000 litres a year. So your 12-year-old whiskey will have been produced at the time when you were only producing 100,000 litres. Yeah. What happens? Do you keep a certain amount back each year so that you can then say, right, well, we've got X amount of that will over the years will mature and then eventually we'll sell it? How does that process work?
Absolutely. So the biggest part of running a distillery is stock management. I'm very, very close with the master blender for Dewars, and it sounds like a very glamorous job. You're in a lab tasting whiskies and mixing them together, but actually, she's an Excel spreadsheet manager is what she does, basically. If you look at it like this, right, so we make 100,000 litres in year 0. This is a new distillery, right? In 3 years' time, you want a bottle of 3-year-old when it's at its minimum age. If you take 20,000 litres of that out and you bottle a 3-year-old, that's great. Let's say 9 years later, you want a bottle of 12-year-old, and you take 30,000 litres of that out and you bottle a 12-year-old. Brilliant. You've only used half your stock, and you've got a 3-year-old and a 12-year-old. The other way you could do it is at 3 years old, you could go, right, we need to get as much of this on the market as possible. Let's bottle all of it. But then 9 years later, the industry expects you to bottle a 12-year-old, and you've got nothing left from year 0. So we have an odd thing where we bottle more 30-year-olds than we do 25-year-olds, because the period between 20 and sort of 28 years ago is when our commitment to making our spirit into famous grouse increased. So we actually have more casks that are 30 years old than that are 25 years old. But the other part of it is those casks that are 25 years old, we can't bottle all of them because in 5 years we have to make a 30-year-old. So there's so much that goes on behind the scenes of that. The other problem is you might have some casks that are 12 years old that are great, but actually people expect the 15 to be better. So you might want to bottle the best casks that are 12 years old, but you have to think about, well, in 3 years, are these best casks going to still be the best casks to make the 15-year-old? It's an incredible system that we have to go through to do it. It's much easier these days because every cask gets a barcode stuck onto the end of it, and you can scan it into the system. Back in the day, you wrote on the end of the cask in chalk what was in there, and that was how you kept track of it, basically. A lot of casks used to go missing, let me tell you. But no, you're right. It's not a planned question at all. It's a very good question because the system of it is mind-blowing, basically.
We have a couple over here.
Cool.
When and why did they flood Loch Turret, and what effect did that have on, and build a dam, and what effect did that have on the distillery?
Very little, to be honest. The main effect it had was it allowed for more consistency with the water. Before they built the dam, we would have taken our water more out of the burn than out of the loch, whereas building the dam and having the control over the water allowed us to take it directly from the loch and to have Scottish Water be monitoring the quality of the water. So the dam was actually a positive for us in terms of the distillery, I would say. The dam was the 1970s. They built the dam.
How worried are you about Mr. Trump?
Oh, it's the billion-dollar question. Not is the quite unsuspected answer, I would imagine. Bit of background. Last time Trump was president, he imposed tariffs on the Scotch whisky industry, specifically on single malt whisky. Now, Americans don't drink single malt whisky. Americans drink blended whisky. So it did have an effect, but not a massive effect. What he has indicated this time is that his tariffs will directly impact countries, not industries. And it will be countries specifically that take jobs away from the United States. Now, the Scotch whisky industry actually provides jobs to the United States in terms of we buy 90% of our casks from America. So it's actually a job producer for the United States. The other part of it is you cannot make Scotch whisky in America. So he knows that if he does increase the tariffs on Scotch whisky again, it will be a vote loser because people want to buy Scotch whisky and the price of it will increase. The current policy of the Scotch whisky industry is essentially keeping our heads down because we don't want to be seen as an industry that's shouting about tariffs and all these kind of things, but we're cautiously optimistic, is what I would say at the moment. That may blow back in our faces.
I've got a question. Before the pandemic, my brother-in-law brought a coachload of pensioners from Coolrush to go around the famous grouse with what I thought was a new visitor centre. Okay. And obviously they'd want a cup of coffee. And do you just have the fine dining, or is there a snacky place?
Yeah, so we did keep the cafe. Our cafe actually closed in November. There was a couple of reasons behind it. The main reason really is that it wasn't making any money, was the main reason, unfortunately. The other reason was when the change around happened, the cafe was put in the wrong place. It was put right next to the restaurant. So it never really fitted. We were doing fine dining, Michelin star restaurant, and it was sharing some of the spaces actually with the cafe. So there was too much crossover. So we have closed the cafe. In its place, we now have more of a sort of whiskey bar offering, but in the whiskey bar, there is coffee machine, teas and coffees and all that kind of thing. And then this summer, we're hopefully going to be working with a local deli who's going to make sandwiches for us that we can sell at the whiskey bar. So it won't have a cafe feel to it. It will be more like a whiskey bar feel, but we will still do coffees and sandwiches and all that kind of thing. Next year, we're doing a bit of a change around about where some of the production stuff happens, and that will free up a space that we're hoping we can then develop into more like a traditional cafe, essentially. But we have the whiskey bar with coffee and a bit of food at the moment, basically. Yeah.
I was a little worried about handing over my microphone to the last questioner. I was worried my wife was going to ask you, why does my husband drink so much whiskey?
Sound like my partner.
Alex, that was wonderful. What it's made me do now, it's motivated me now to start saving some money to buy my wife a bottle of 12-year-old whiskey.
Absolutely.
But, no, it's an absolutely fascinating talk, that. And we do visit Glenturret occasionally, and I have absolutely no idea, as you wouldn't have, unless somebody like you comes along and tells us what the history is of its existence. So thank you again for that, and it was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you as well for coming along today and joining in with the talk. The next talk will be Pitlochry Theatre. We haven't got Alan Cummings coming along, but I thought it would be interesting just to hear. They've got the activity that goes on there, and tell us a little bit more about them. I know it's very well used, so I look forward to seeing most of you there. So thank you very much, and have a safe journey home. Thank you.